Hi, I'm Dr. JT Welsh, and welcome to this very exciting Festival Ideas event. Maybe you've been to some of the events already in the Festival Ideas. We've got quite a special one here tonight. We've got some words, we've got some swords, we've got some dueling words, dueling swords, and desire, and kind of play with all these different things. And we have some very, very exciting poets to bring you some great poetry. So you can sit back and enjoy and have a nice Sunday evening of this. I'm a lecturer in the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York, and I teach writing there. We have lots of different events, and hopefully, at different points you've been down to visit us, and there will be someday soon when you can come back and see events in the department and at the university. But we're going to do our best to bring some of that literature and bring some good poetry into your home or wherever you're viewing this tonight. So how it's going to work is I'm just going to introduce all four of our poets here briefly in a second. Then we're going to have a reading from Mary Jean Chan. Then we're going to have some of our students giving you a couple of poems each. And then we're going to finish up with Vahni Capildeo. So Mary Jean Chan is coming to us from London this evening. Mary Jean's debut poetry collection, Flesh, was published last year by Faber and Faber. You might have read it or come across it. It's a nice blue cover. It was the winner of the 2019 Costa Book Award for Poetry, and it was recently shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize and the Jollick Prize. Mary Jean has twice been shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best Single Poem as well, and she's a recipient of the Eric Gregory Award. Mary Jean co-edited as well the most recent issue of the Poetry Review, so you might have come across that fantastic issue. Mary Jean grew up in Hong Kong, and she lectures in creative writing at Oxford Brookes University. Our two students who will be reading in the middle of the program tonight are first Georgia Ingalls, who is a PhD candidate here at the University of York, working on early modern religious poetry. Her thesis explores the influence of Philip and Mary Sidney's Psalms on 17th century devotional poetry and makes new claims for Mary Sidney's significant contribution to the religious and political culture of early modern England. So we'll get a taste of that. We also have Emily Pritchard, who is an MA student here at York and currently writing her dissertation on butch poetics. Emily has poems published in The Kindling and Poetry Birmingham. And we'll finish tonight with poetry from Vahni Capildeo, who is our relatively new writer in residence at the University of York and will be with us for the next few years. Vahni is also the outgoing poetry fellow at the Seamus Heaney Center at Queen's University Belfast. Capildeo draws on their background in medieval studies, translation theory, and lexicography to find individual, collaborative, multimedia forms for expressing plural senses of memory, place, and displacement. And their work also includes Measures of Expatriation, their collection from Carcanet in 2016 that you might know. It was the winner of the Forward Prize in 2016 for Best Collection. Vahni has also recently published Odyssey Calling with Sad Press, and that's a chapbook which ranges from immersive theater of azure noise to the Windrush Scandal, praise, and prayer. You might have come across Vahni's Active Silence performances and selections. New ones are posted every week, every Friday on the University of York website. So yeah, we will go through these poets. I'll get out of the way and let them read. And if you want to post questions in the Q&A, at the bottom of your screens, there's a place for that. Feel free to post those at any point, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end to go through some of your questions and hear from the poets. So to get everyone in the mood, we're just going to take a little, we're going to play a quick clip here of Mary Jean doing some fencing.
Hi, everyone. So lovely to be here tonight. Thank you so much to Helen and JT and Vahni for curating this wonderful event. It's great to join you all during this very somber and difficult time. So I hope this finds you all safe and well. Tonight I'll be reading from my debut collection, Flesh. It's taken a title from the fencing term, which I used to practice when I was younger in Hong Kong. And the flesh is actually a fencing move where you run at high speed at your opponent. And I've always been very enamored by this word, which obviously puns on the English word flesh, the flesh of the body. The other thing to say is, I suppose this this book of mine really tries to play with words and language. As a bilingual speaker, I'm interested in the sounds and the nuances between languages. And I'd like to quote from Vahni's wonderful Measures of Expatriation, where they write, "Language is my home, not one particular language." And that really resonates with me. So I'll share with you all some poems tonight. Practice. As a teenager, fencing was the closest thing I knew to desire. All the girls swapping one uniform for another before practice, their white dresses replaced by breeches. I thought we were princes in a fairy tale with a twist, since there were no princesses to be taken, wed. As knights, we were told to aim for an imaginary spot just above our opponent's left breast. Often, I left a bruise, the blade's tip ricocheting off chest guards onto skin. Just as often, I would feel yellow blooms of ache, where the girl I thought was beautiful had pierced my heart. Hours later, I would transform. I would head back home with a deepening sense of dread, my bruises fading to quiet. A hurry of English. What isn't obvious, because I intend to obfuscate. Oh, choose its own tail like a rabid dog. What does it say about me, this obsession written in a language I never chose? My desires dress themselves in a hurry of English to avoid my mother's gaze. How I typed Shakespeare, then homoeroticism plus Shakespeare into Google over and over. My mother did not understand the difference between English words, so she let me be. A public history seeps into the body, the way tea leaves soak up the scent of a fridge. An odorless room is not necessarily without trauma. We must interrogate the walls. My skin is yellow because it must. Love is kind because it must. Admit it aloud. For this next poem, all you need to know is that the title takes from Adrian Rich's collection of the same name, and the last two lines of my poem are in Adrian Rich's words. A wild patience has taken me this far. I am writing in the voice of my most hopeful self. Amnesia was my daily bread. Thank God for fan fiction, for it gets better, for poets audacious enough to mention the body. Do you know what camouflage looks like on a day-to-day basis? Checking the coast is clear before opening a single tab and multiple decoys on a screen. Surreptitiously reading Shakespeare, the scene where Cesario woos Olivia. Watching my parents' faces for a sign to hold a tidal wave back. A daily prayer for the strength to confess nothing at all times. One day, it becomes a choice to walk out of this life or to begin living mine. I left half of my language behind to escape my impeccable persona. How I wanted to perform a heroic act to gain acceptance into the kingdom of ordinary people. To love a city and to not have it love you back is its own form of torture. When I met a beautiful stranger for the first time, I was deeply afraid of her tenderness. An appointment with a therapist led to a second date. I was given permission, needed permission. She held my hand till I began to comprehend the territory of skin, its frantic heart and silent ponds. Most nights, I dream of my mother's face, by turns harsh and tender. In a nightmare, I shouted at her, "Neither you nor I are the enemy." What do mothers ask their own daughters everywhere in the world? Is there a question? Ask me something. The heart of the matter. I could not bear this bewildering joy, awakening to a room without walls, by which I mean a room without eyes. In a dream, I keep seeing her, my head mistress. Though she is smiling, I am terribly afraid. "There is something you want to tell the world," she'd say, sipping a sencha tea, though she is not Japanese. "What?" I'd say. And she'd say, "That," pointing in the direction of my heart. And I'd say, "What?" And she'd say, "That, right there, that ache." The calligrapher. Try grasping a piece of wood between your thumb, middle, and ring finger, as if the dripping of ink was a typhoon you could play in. Loosen the right wrist, scrape the weight of too much from brush or heart across ink bowl. Let its round rim reassure. Sculpt the brush tip till shrill, sharp as paper cut. Let ink seep, a dot, a line, then a mad dash to the last stroke, till interlocking arms form terraced paddies bursting with meaning. The character fortune, made up of the shirt on your back, the roof over your head, and the promise of a stomach satisfied with rice. When people ask why, reply, "My mother wished I would write with the grace of those ancient Chinese poets, whose tapestry now slips easily from my 10-year-old tongue into a diptych of shapes. Hour upon hour, my wrist aches as the ink dries to a crust. My eyes blink back water, but this is precisely the moment to continue. Once more the fingers dip, slide, lift. I am not a dancer, but this is a dance. Hours spill into a pot of tea leaves as my mother tells me, "See how Chinese characters are sunflowers that seek out the eyes. Seeds of ink unfurl suddenly from your wrist, blooming into time." Flesh. History. At the age of 13, I wielded a blade because I had a firm grip. I was in love with Shakespeare, and the school team needed an essayist. When my mother flew to Linz to watch me go 3-4 down against a former champion, she gripped the railing until her marriage ring was folded into flesh. Strategy. You never duel against the same person, even if it is the same person. On the piste, once the blades are tilted upwards to signify respect, you recalibrate to thwart their every move. She was disarmed by my tears, a timeout to breathe through the yellowing bruise on my pale yellow skin. Footwork. Changing into school uniform felt like cross-dressing. I took my time, removing mask, then chest protector, lingering at the breeches. The day I learned to lunge, I began to walk differently, saw distance as a kind of desire. Once, my blade's tip gently flicked her wrist. She said it was the perfect move. Parry riposte. My greatest weakness, the riposte. In the changing room, the girl I was about to duel said I smelled of bitter gourd. You were practicing the flesh. Inevitably, I collided with her, a blur of entangled blades. I glimpsed her wry expression through our mask's steel mesh, her gleaming, smiling lips. Grip and point control. French or pistol grip. One offers stability, the other more room for surprise. Before I came out to the world, I asked myself, French or pistol grip? Now you say, you're a great lover. Thank years of hard work on point control. How two fingers maneuver the blade's tip. A flurry of sickle moons. Beauty. All the metaphors have failed. The sea is infinitely breakable. My mother is raging the way waves do. Anger is a secondary emotion, a statement from my therapist who specializes in honesty, a rare trait that calms me, and she is so beautiful. I wish I could summon all the beauty in this world, ward off any jagged feelings. I cannot stand the faces of beautiful women. I feel a deep need to protect any plausible display of happiness. You see, my mother is fearful of open windows, the abiding terror of the world's light. Wish. I would like to live like the trees. My lover often says, "Look up," as she admires a canopy of green. Her tree-like behavior astounds me. If you looked within me now, you'd see that my languages are like roots gnarled in soil, one and indivisible, except the world divides me endlessly. Some days I dare not look at the trees. They are such hopeful creatures. If the legislators of our world looked to their trees for guidance, would they reconsider everything? Lately, I've been trying to write a poem that might birth a tree. A genuine acceptance of the self continues to elude me. Thank you so much for listening, and this is my last poem called The Importance of Tea. When your aunt arrived, she asked for normal tea, which to my untrained ears sounded a bit like normality. In Hong Kong, normal tea is green or white or red. It took my mind several moments to move from green to white to red to land on black. Your aunt was flexible. Any Assam, Darjeeling, or Earl Grey? We only had matcha, some loose-leaf iron Buddha in the cupboard, no milk. Your aunt looked at you as if you'd failed at being British, me as if I'd failed to properly assimilate. Afterwards, you said I was projecting onto your aunt the fears I harbored. No matter how many years I've spent in this country, how I interpret normal tea, what is normal to me. You are learning Mandarin Chinese. I see how the characters are split for you. Signifier and signified refuse to conjoin. That's what happened when your aunt asked for the normal tea. Days later, when a waiter brought us white sugar for our oolong at a cafe, I caught your gaze. We laughed and left the sachets unopened. Thank you.
Hi, so this first reading is Sonnet 10 from Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella. Reason, in faith thou art well served, that still wouldst brabbling be with sense and love in me. I rather wished thee climb the Muses' hill, or reach the fruit of nature's choicest tree, or seek heaven's course, or heaven's inside to see. Why shouldst thou toil our thorny soil to till? Leave sense and those which sense's objects be. Deal thou with powers of thoughts, leave love to will. But thou wouldst needs fight both with love and sense, with sword of wit, giving wounds of dispraise. till downright blows did foil thy cunning fence. For soon as they strake thee with Stella's rays, reason thou kneel'st, and offered straight to prove by reason good reason her to love. And this second poem is from Philip Sidney's sister, Mary Sidney, and it's a paraphrase of Psalm 57. Thy mercy, Lord, Lord, now thy mercy show. On thee I lie, to thee I fly. Hide me, hive me as thine own, till these blasts be overblown, which now do fiercely blow. To highest God I will erect my cry, who quickly shall dispatch this all. He shall down from heaven send, from disgrace me to defend, his love and verity. My soul encaged lies with lions brood, villains whose hands are fiery brands, teeth more sharp than shaft or spear, tongues far better edge do bear than swords to shed my blood. As high as highest heaven can give thee place, O Lord, ascend, and thence extend with most bright, most glorious show over all the earth below the sunbeams of thy face. Me to entangle every way I go, their trap and net is ready set. Holes they dig, but their own holes, pitfalls make for their own souls. So, Lord, oh, serve them so. My heart prepared is my heart to spread thy praise with tuned lays. Wake my tongue, my lute awake, thou my harp the consort make, myself will bear a part. Myself, when first the morning shall appear, with voice and string so will thee sing, that this earthly globe, and all treading on this earthly ball, my praising note shall hear. For God, my only God, thy gracious love is mounted far above each star. Thy unchanged verity, heavenly wings do lift as high as clouds have room to move. As high as highest heaven can give thee place, O Lord, ascend, and thence extend with most bright, most glorious show over all the earth below, the sunbeams of thy face. Right, so now you'll see a clip from the University of York Fencing Society.
Hi everyone. So when I was asked to take part in this Swords and Words event, I found I didn't actually have any poems about swords, but I do have a little poem about a needle, and I knew another little poem about a needle, and I thought, well, needles are effectively tiny swords, right? So I thought I'd pair up these poems in a little miniature fencing match. The first one's by me, and the second one is by Kay Ryan, who's an American poet. So this is my poem, and it's called Little Wound. Little wound. I made you without thinking. The man said, "Lie down," and I was shocked, like I don't lie down all the time. I lay down with my shoes on and offered up my ear's hardest part. It hurt more than I'd thought, but I did not cry out. I breathed out very slowly and said, "Thank you." It was October then. Little wound, I didn't think you'd still be weeping now the spring has come. Wound of my own making, I didn't think I would be tending to you still, holding to the place it hurts, sea salt a spoonful of hot water. And this is by Kay Ryan. It's called A Plain Ordinary Steel Needle Can Float on Pure Water. And the title is from Ripley's Believe It or Not, which is a non-fiction comic strip. So it's basically fun facts. So, a plain ordinary steel needle can float on pure water. And I'm going to read it twice because Kay Ryan always reads her poems twice, and it's very short. Who hasn't seen a plain ordinary steel needle float serene on water as if lying on a pillow? It's a treat to see water so rubbery, a needle so peaceful, the point encased in the tenderest dimple. It seems so simple when things or people have modified each other's qualities somewhat. We almost forget the oddity of that. Who hasn't seen a plain ordinary steel needle float serene on water as if lying on a pillow? It's a treat to see water so rubbery, a needle so peaceful, the point encased in the tenderest dimple. It seems so simple when things or people have modified each other's qualities somewhat. We almost forget the oddity of that.
Hi, I'm going to read 3 poems that have actual swords in, and I should give a content warning that these are mostly not very pleasant swords. The first one, Transatlantic, is from a calendar that runs winter to winter, so it's a 14-month calendar. This is February, and it was inspired by seeing a display of swords in the late 1990s in the Imperial War Museum in Leeds, which appeared to be floating in a glass case in a glass section of the building, which was, I think, bridging 2 more solid-looking buildings, these peculiar suspended swords. And this was partly when I started thinking about the way people use words to cut up identities. Transatlantic. The person who is made to listen will fall in love with people who know how to hear. The people who know how to hear are people who have something to tell. They live to tell it. The listener loves and listens. The people who know how to hear, who have something to tell it, to learn to live at a distance from what they have lived. The person who has a love for the people who have something to tell listens and learns to live in a present that starts with somebody's past. They have time to listen. They have all the time in the world. Like swords crossed on the walls of museums, they carry the memory of possible sharpness mounted on the cold of their hearts. Their understanding of passion is only called into service as a passionate understanding, as a passion to understand. Now, the next poem I'm going to read is actually included in Sophie Collins' wonderful edition of various people's writings on translation and the innovative translations, Currently and Emotion. And Sophie explains it much better than I can, where one of the things she says is that this poem, Snake in the Grass, responds to a pattern-welded, wavy or snaky sword blade kept at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And this upends the inherited ekphrastic dynamic in which the poet traditionally speaks for or through the ostensibly silent object, because here the sword not only speaks, but directed speech towards the museum's visitors. Snake in the Grass, for Alaric Hall. My man was menstrual, had fever dreams of carbonizing metal. In scattering I began, impure, then piled, twisted, fused, quenched in oil and sweeter fluids, my long form agent and symbol of heavy terror, what it is to be split. City of Oxford, you forget little enough, but rather excel in techniques of diversion and cover. City, you have renamed Group Cunt and Slaughter streets, driven streams to run their own burials. With false surgery, you have sealed the wide, one-eyed mercy of a lake beneath a car park's sweat, the clang of coins. Under Christchurch Tower, under kings of new history, the Jewish town lies in pre-expulsion sleep. Under that again, nameless bones. Do not dishonor me. I am not sleeping. Slide your eye back into its drowsy basket. Are you alive when grass is cut? To the slip of blades reptile quick to stain, to twine. Such things share my nature, whatever is woven, whatever heats up iridescing with force. Do not shun me. I am not sleeping. Glass is the least security. My kind's for reuse, willing to coil cold in the earth, till each deadly resurrection through your changes of nation, till your kind hand comes and the smith repairs us. Slide your eye into the wave and wind of me. Forget your wife if you still have one. The two of us decide who's for the taking. Bring me to your son, blossoming in his cradle. Introduce us. I have a name. Man, join us together. There's wisdom in my core. Now, this was actually inspired not by a complete sword, but by the hilt of a sword and a bit of a broken blade, which had been fished up from a river in Oxfordshire. And what's notable is that very often you can't tell the age of a sword by the blade and the hilt together, because if you were raiding a barrow, as you sensibly would do if you were running short of metal, or if there happened to be a barrow on your land, or you were passing a barrow, then you might find part of a good weapon which you could reforge and use. Okay, the second sword is even more upsetting. It's the sword of Sir Hugh de Morville, one of the four knights who killed St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury in 1170. And there's a replica of this sword which was on view in Carlisle Cathedral. I don't know if it's still on view, because the original sword is thought to have been given there. Now, Thomas Becket became Archbishop in 1164, and he was martyred on the 29th of December in 1170, so not very long at all. And Hugh de Morville, although he was a Norman knight whose family had by inheritance the title of Constables of Scotland, was also, as Prince David of Scotland was a Prince of Cumbria, he was also the Lord of Westmoreland. And after the four knights assassinated St. Thomas, they fled to Knaresborough Castle. And while you mightn't want this to be the best press for Yorkshire, you have to think about the way people might possibly repent. You don't really know whether they repented towards the end of their lives. And I'm fairly sure nobody says Mass for the souls of the four assassins, but I wonder whether the assassins' souls might be pleading. Disposal of a weapon. I had to take it somewhere. That was a steel. I took it home. That was in stone. They had to leave it somewhere. That was the shell. The church stepped in. That was in storm. Steel, stone, shell, storm. Another cathedral. Rage rising. Crowds towards us against our hard work. Thomas, head split, forcing Herring's gate with his loud and bloody treasons. Pray how could I, lacking fluent parlance, else control them? As clouds address my hilly sheep in Northumbria, in a tyrant's robed balconied words, with sweet that trade poisons, visitors, modern, unburied, probing my rests, after my doubtless victim's blessing. Also you thoughtless, yet in secret capitally troubled. That is not my sword. Though something targets your head, overhangs the roof, disposed to make short gold of your moment of starred blue. That is not my sword. We are elsewhere. Steel, stone, shell, storm. I, Hugh de Morville, Lord of Knaresborough, honour of Westmoreland, lineal man stamped down man-killer, saint-maker by Canterbury history, bless or at least excoriate, do not forget my name. And I thought of this poem rather than numerous other sword poems I have, because I was wondering who on social media is currently calling for turbulent persons to be removed. Thank you. And now what you'll see is another clip of the fabulous Mary Jean while you put together your final questions for the Q&A.
All right, we're back. Yes, amazing. Yeah, sort of reeling from all the different readings, and hopefully you enjoyed those as well. We've got some questions coming in, and we've got a bit of time here, yeah, to have some conversation and to digest things. So feel free to keep posting any questions if anything's come up. But I think we'll just start off with a question that is for Mary Jean. This is someone saying, this is an anonymous attendee, saying, I'd just like to say that your poems were beautiful and incredibly touching, but they're asking, do you ever worry about people's reactions when writing about such personal topics?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting, right? Because I think there is this presumption that, firstly, that all poetry is autobiographical or confessional or personal. And while a lot of my writing does, I suppose, derive from my life and lived experiences, I would argue that a lot of these poems that you heard just now are, in fact, fictionalized scenarios. So what I mean by that is that obviously the kernel or the emotional core of these poems are true because I lived through them. But the sort of moment-to-moment play of events or the way in which my memory has since reconstructed events, I think all of that actually leaves a lot of room for creativity and for the poet to kind of creatively construct, the past, if you will. And I do think, a lot of poems, I think by, women or women of color even tend to be read in an autobiographical way. And that's to say, obviously a lot of it is, in my case, autobiographical. But I would also push back and say, when people ask me about how I feel, because in my mind, these are already recreated and sort of deeply crafted poems, then I don't feel the need to sort of say that this is exactly what happened, or feel like I'm telling the world specific things in their specific order of events, because I've kind of already reimagined it. And I also invite the reader to reimagine the event themselves by inserting themselves into the poem, by linking the poem to their own life experiences. So that's sort of my way of dealing with it, if you will.
Amazing, thank you. Well, I've got a question. This is another one from Mary Jean, but it's gonna get us into the kind of the fencing and the swords side of things. This is a question that comes from Catherine Edwards, and she wants to say, first of all, thank you for lovely readings, because she also shared a love of fencing as a teenager, and it's taken me right back to those times, the sense of anonymity behind the mask, and the choice between contact and evasion, the poised stillness before launching or defending an attack, and the literal electric charge coursing through the blade. So Catherine's question is, it relates to the choice of the blade. Catherine wants to know, how does fencing with an épée, foil, or saber affect the rhythm or the energy of the engagement? Because she found the saber to be most expressive, even flamboyant, but envied the control of the foilist. So do you have thoughts on the qualities of the épée that most fascinated you?
Yeah, that's a great, very specific question. So I must admit, I never did saber, but I started off as a foilist and then moved into the épée. And it's interesting because I think épée suited me the best in that it actually is the slowest of the three weapons. Not many people know that, but sort of épée is the heaviest in terms of actual weight of the sword and the blade, and it's the slowest. in terms of tempo. A lot of épée is actually sort of, as you saw in the York fencing reel, a lot of sort of moving around on the piece and waiting and biding your time. And sometimes waiting for your opponent to make a mistake. And then that's when you sort of make the lunge or you do the flesh. And for me, that was really beautiful because I think there's so much craft to épée. And not to say that there's no craft to foil or saber, but saber really relies on speed. You sort of can't wait around because of the specific thing called the right of way. You have to charge at your opponent, essentially. Whereas with épée, there's no right of way. You can wait and bide your time. So I've always found that to be quite poetic and more suited to my sort of style of fencing, if you will. And also this one thing that people might not know, but in épée, you basically, the taller you are, the more advantage you have. So I was considered quite tall for my team. So they deployed me to the épée team, basically.
Amazing. Well, Vahni, I wondered if you wanted to come in here because we've had a few questions here as well about what attracted you to swords as a poetic object, or particularly kind of not very nice swords and giving voice to them. Is there something you want to say a bit about why so many sword poems, or what they do for you? Is it similar?
Well, one reason that I'm so interested in swords is I actually inherited a sword, which was a Rajput personal sword from my great-great-grandfather of possibly Indo-Persian work. I no longer have it. It's passed to other people in the family. And this had a lovely little bird for the handle and an ornate scabbard, and was the sword that my ancestor would have carried with him and valued more than his wife if he had one, and about as much as his horse, which he probably had. And so I had a sense of having a sword in the closet, but I didn't really know what to do with it. Then when I started doing Old Norse, I was fascinated by the vocabulary for swords, because, for example, the word that I mentioned, which I'm not going to say because there are enough Old Norse speakers to start coming in to ask me whether they've done modern or reconstructed old pronunciation, then that word for pattern welding, where strips of metal are twisted and hammered together, and that happens again and again. So you get a blade that is flexible, and if you hit it, it doesn't shatter as easily. But it also acquires this weird serpentine look, an iridescent look. And in terms of color words in Old Norse, what's more important is not whether something is, for example, red or blue, but whether it's matte or shiny. And this is kind of shiny, variegated, so very interesting to look at. And I have a strong interest in color words, and the sword sort of fed into that. But the other thing I was thinking of was just violence. And there's a wordplay, of course, that words and sword are perfect anagrams, words and sword. Then there's the peculiarity that if you flip a sword upside down, you get a cross. And then there is, well, depending on the shape of the sword, which I mean, the 12th century sword certainly is a cruciform cross-shaped sword, which goes back to Viking shapes, Viking being used inaccurately there. But the other thing is just the sense of danger in both. And I think people don't add up the different senses of danger you might have. Say the sense of danger you'd have from the police or a protest, or the sense of danger you'd have in how you're represented or not in a law case, how you're misrepresented or not in the media, how you interact with others in the kind of echo chamber of social media. And I wanted to relatch the sword and the word together with a sense of danger. And while I will be the first person to use the phrase Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter, I'm calling in from the global south. I'm not in Britain at the moment. And what strikes me at the moment is there's been one martyrdom that has sparked off a wave of protest, but what we are deeply aware of here in the South is the global South, is the continuing violence and martyrdom, the endless violence and the transgenerational suffering, which shouldn't need these needling moments of hyper visibility in the media to be addressed. They should be addressed as every day. So yeah, it's about violence basically, and who has responsibility to speak and how.
Yeah, well, thank you, because I think a few people have, a couple people have asked questions about this, the relationship between the violence, I guess, in some of these poems, or in poetry's kind of usefulness in moments like this, in protest, and in yeah, just times of crisis generally. And I wondered if others want to jump in here, or Mary Jean, if you had further, more specific thoughts about how the violence or the potential violence of the sword poem connects with, poetry's usefulness in protest.
I suppose speaking to poetry's relevance for me, especially in these times, as Vahni says, there's the violent everyday, really, that a lot of people live through, and these events are not new. They've been recurring over and over, but obviously there are moments of hypervisibility, and then that sparks off more sort of visible protests against it. But for me, the power of the poem is that it's so specific. It does not allow language to obfuscate, to hide behind propaganda, and we see language used so casually and carelessly in the media, in government policy, if you will, but the poem, I think, naturally resists that. And so for me, a poem doesn't have to be allowed to be a protest poem. It doesn't even have to read as a protest poem visibly, but its attention to language makes it, I think, a tool for resistance.
Emily and Georgia, do you have thoughts on this? I guess either as as readers or writers of poetry, are there things that we can come to? I'm just thinking of the different wounds, the historical wounds, the different kinds of things that you were talking about. Is there a kind of solace that we can take from these things? Like, you're both muted. I don't know if you.
I don't have lots to say about this, but I guess one of the main things that sustains racism is emotional disconnect of white people. And I think that we need to work against that in general, but when we listen to poetry of people of color, and use poetry as a means to become more empathetic and fight against that disconnect.
Thank you.
I concur with Emily.
Is there a sense that in the poems that you were reading, Georgia, the older poems, is there a continuity, I guess, in the way that they're thinking about the sword objects and the kind of potential violence there, and a kind of urgency and immediacy that is? How did you connect that to kind of contemporary?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I mean, I guess swords probably, played a far greater role in the material reality of early modern lives. Sword play happened on the stage, but also it happened in the streets, far more, in a far more prevalent way than we understand violence, than the way violence is enacted nowadays. I mean, I suppose thinking about swords and desire has, in the early modern period, maybe lends itself to thinking also about patriarchy and about gendered conceptions of violence and ownership and property, because swords or rapiers are often invoked in the lyric tradition, often as a way of thinking about desire and penetration of absent other woman, Stella in this case, in the case of Philip Sidney. And so, I mean, it's a lot of language to do with swords are deeply embedded in this idea of obtaining women and conquering women. And I think in that way, I think it's quite a lot different from how we think about swordsmanship now. So I suppose that's one way of thinking about it. And but also there's this dichotomy set up frequently between swordsmanship and song, actually. So in a poem by I think it's Anne Broadstreet, when she has immigrated to the New World, she writes a poem about David, so David of the Psalms, and let me just see if I can. I think I've got the quote to hand. She says, so she's talking about David. David, Judah's most heroic king, whose glorious deeds in arms the world can tell. A rosy-cheeked musician thou knowest well. He knew well how to handle sword and harp, and how to strike full sweet as well as sharp. And you've got this idea of the object of a harp and the object of a sword, both are like objects that yield great power and powers to persuade and to incite. And so swords in the early modern period are great, and I think has a far more pervasive understanding than swords now, I guess.
Yeah. I think, I mean, a few things you're saying there about the kind of the gendering of sword play and the kind of the different kind of expectations or its uses, its symbolism in different places leads to, a few people are asking questions about the kind of the fluidity, Mary Jean, in your poems in terms of kind of in terms of gender and sexual desire and the kind of the queerness of that desire, but also that sense that there's a kind of in a few of the poems that you read, there's a sort of learning process. There's a kind of coming to terms either with one's own desire, in terms of the speaker, or a process of writing or learning a language or hearing your own language back. I wonder if you could say a bit about that kind of that path.
Yeah, I suppose, the first thing to say is, the way competitive fencing is structured is that it's very binary. So you've got the women's épée and then you've got the men's épée, and obviously, that doesn't fit entirely onto gender queerness, but obviously then it meant I just fenced with the women, and that made it quite a queer space because we were all, sort of jousting and piercing each other's hearts. So that for me was one of the first, I suppose, queer spaces I ever inhabited without it being overtly queer. I could actually have crushes on people or, just kind of felt like strong, and I felt comfortable in my body, which I didn't always feel outside of that very, for me, queer space. And the other thing for me that is fencing for me was a very relational sport, in that so much of épée, especially because it's about biding your time, it's about watching your opponent, and reacting to them, or, eliciting something from them so that you can then counterattack. And so for me, that was a very beautiful kind of relational combat. You are each other's opponent, but you're also trying to understand each other, perceive each other. And so for me, that motif really works when I'm sort of bringing it into the mother-daughter relationship, where for me, there was a whole period of combat, if you will, or conflict. But then it was also out of love and a desire to understand one another and to come to terms with a lot of things. So yeah, for me, that's sort of how I perceive, learning and mutual understanding. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, maybe to kind of, wrap things up and bring things back around. I mean, Georgia, you already mentioned the Broad Street, but a few people are asking for recommendations of other great sword poems. Are there? I mean, could we put together a whole anthology or collection of sword poems? Vahni, you're smiling. You have things in mind? Are you recommendations to send people off to find other word swords?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of stealing this from Professor Helen Smith, who is with us, kindly pasting the things into the chat and generally keeping things running behind the scenes. And she was remarking on the play between word and sword in a number of George Herbert's poems, which I also found to be very much played out in his proverbs. Then, of course, I've just recently read through the wisdom books in the Bible, and there are lots of really interesting references to swords there. And the Bible itself is predicated on the idea of the word. So that, but I was thinking more in terms of play though than actual poems, JT, because one of the reasons I was smiling was that Mary Jean, you brought back so beautifully that feeling of non-fatal play, of the sort of conversation and the extensibility, the touching extensibility into the other's space.
Thank you. Yeah, I suppose, I mean, my knowledge of swords art literature is actually woefully inadequate, but my first encounter of swords within literature was Twelfth Night, and I really love the film version where Cesario, who I think is actually a great, character. She just rides off on horseback and, jousts with Orsino, and then they have this very homoerotic scene where obviously Orsino thinks Cesario is a man, and then it's just that kind of underlying homoeroticism made me always feel that swords were a very queer thing. But that's my particular experience with it.
Emily or Georgia, do you have any other final recommendations for us, or sword poems you come across? Not to put too much pressure on you. It feels a bit like a quiz show. Okay, I'm naming that sword. All right, why don't we wrap things up there and just leave things out? It's really nice. So hopefully people are seeing in the chat, Naomi has posted information there about getting hold of books with the poems that you've heard tonight. You can check out Fox Lane Books. They've got all the Festival Ideas books. And there's lots of other poetry coming up in the Festival Ideas. Naomi's posting about the Square Haunting event with Francesca Wade next weekend. I know there's another event next weekend with Selena Godden talking about space, I believe, and a few other things going on. Check out the program. And as I say, keep an eye on things happening. We have our own Writers at York events. Vahni will be curating over the next couple of years. So hopefully at some point we can get together in real life and have some real sword play. But for now, I guess we can use swords to enforce social distancing. But thank you all again for the beautiful poetry, and thanks to everyone watching wherever you are.